Okay. All right. Thank you for being here. My name is Denise Hills. Ruth Dewar and Steve Diggs are also here. And we're going to be talking to you today about generating an at-risk data commons, as well as some other related activities that are feeding into the development of this. Ruth is going to start with an overview of some of the work we've been doing. Steve is going to give us a brief description of some related activities through CoData. And then I think the bulk of our session we're actually going to spend going through a user scenario that we've been working on. That I think most people in this room are going to have a lot of really great contributions to that. So thank you for being here. We do have online participants, so please be sure to use the mic when you have a question. We're going to have our somebody running around with a mic. Wave, thank you. Alexis, sorry, not enough caffeine. I knew your name began with an A, and I was thinking Alexandria, and I'm like, that's not right. It was close. So please be aware that we want to make sure. And Alexis is going to be monitoring the online chats in case our online participants have comments and questions. Thank you.
All right, can everybody hear me? Yeah. Great. So many things have happened over the last year with the what used to be called the DataAtRisk group, which is now thinking that it's calling itself the At-Risk Data Commons. And so this is really just a status update. Okay. Why? The arrows are not working. Okay. Weird. And so what this group is, and I should say this is a vision. So it's not 100% implemented at this point, but that it's a website and non-profit organization that connects data with, or people with data at risk, to volunteers, data experts, and additional resources to try and help them not be at risk anymore. So it's kind of a match.com for data at risk and orphaned or surrendered data. Oh, now it's working fine. So the way this is supposed to work is that if you have a request coming in, which we already have way more requests than we probably will ever be able to deal with, then that request is logged in the system. An advocate who is an expert, data manager type person, assesses that request, kind of sorts it into, I'm sorry, you can't give us 1 day notice of 30 terabytes of data and ask us to do something before tomorrow. And otherwise splits it into tasks, like metadata tasks versus data tasks versus digitization tasks, etc. And once it's split into tasks, those tasks go on a list that heroes can look at, select, and work on. And when they're done working on them, then it goes back basically to the advocates again, who look at them and go, okay, I think that might be a problem. Please go fix this. Or this looks great. I'm going to send it to the submitter and see if they're happy. And if the submitter is happy, then basically we've had a successful request. And of these, we actually have prototypes for just those two parts. In other words, there is a prototype for being able to submit requests, and there is a prototype for being able to search and look at requests and choose them. So where are we at in this whole process? We're working on becoming a nonprofit in Colorado. I personally would rather do this through ESIP, but I don't think that's going to happen. So it'll probably be through Colorado. We have specification documents that do exist and which are updated as we address new parts of that process. Probably not as fast as we'd like, but there it goes. We are working on use cases that drive the process details. For example, as a result of the use case work, we've come to the conclusion that there are many kinds of data heroes. In other words, many kinds of expertise that may be needed to rescue data. In other words, you may need to know how to do good image digitization. You may need to know how to find data repositories of the appropriate type. You may need to know about certain kinds of metadata. You may need to understand how to QA and QC the results. You may need to have a programmer who is capable of taking pre-ASCII, pre-EPSIDIC, pre-BCD data and converting it into CDF. And then another thing we learned is that, you know, this bit about multiple tasks is very real. We also have been working with the Science Gateways community. We went to the boot camp last year. And as of this next month, they're giving us basically a quarter-time technical support crew to help work on interfaces and that sort of thing. They have another crew that does UI UX work and security, and we have a meeting with them this month to talk about what, if anything, they can do there. And we have started working on these use cases, and this is the use case we're going to walk through here in a minute, which is saving 1930s stream and waterways images. And I created a few diagrams just to show that we actually, you know, this is sort of a state-based system as we're thinking of it, the interface. We don't do the data stuff in here. We just record statuses and what happened. And so this is showing that, you know, you get requests in. Yellow means it's sort of a things to do. And the final states are either red or green. You can reject a request because you can't deal with it today. Or the request becomes complete. And then at the next lower level, once it's into tasks, then each individual task goes through this kind of a state transition process. And with that, okay, all right.
Just so you know, the links to Ruth's presentation, Steve's presentation, as well as the user scenario we're going to work through are now in the session description. Ruth has already uploaded her presentation to Figshare. We'll get Steve's presentation up to Figshare probably later today. The user scenario, since it's a little more dynamic right now, we're not going to put that in Figshare yet, but the link will be there. So Steve, if you're ready. Can you go do that? I love how our techie people, we just have tech failures all the time. We do tech differently. While Steve changes the sharing on his presentation, you may have noticed that I have put up a kind of one of the slides that Ruth did. We've presented at a couple different scenarios, a couple different places about how we envision this, the data commons, the DataRescue, the DataAtRisk commons, you know, with the different roles and how we work through it. And I'm continuing to stall while Steve changes the sharing. It's a good thing we all know each other pretty well. How many people are in here? This is your first exposure to our data at risk process tool. Yay, thank you. What brought you here? She's right there. She's right here with the mic because we got to kill time. Well,
I'm Don Collins. I'm at NCEI.
Mhm.
Well, data at risk is just sort of as a broad category of
Mhm.
kinds of data is a growing problem actually. Right now, I'm looking at what to do with some historical analog materials that we need to either agree that they've been adequately digitized and they can be disposed, or reassess that digitization effort from 30 or years ago. So that's a consideration as an example of, do we need to do additional data rescue on something, or do we rescue it enough? And so that's, so this concept is something that's currently on the front burner in my universe when I go back to the office.
And every time we'll have a tech failure, we'll have a little, shout out introduction for everybody to do to kill time. Okay, so the recent trend has been, my recent trend has been to, I guess you don't know who I am, Steve Diggs. I'm with Scripps Institution of Oceanography. I used to co-chair, or status unknown, a couple of different groups that have to do with data rescue with Denise, in Research Data Alliance, involved in a couple of clusters within ESIP, as well as we have this group in CODATA, which is the International Council for Science's data arm, and sort of a older parent of ESIP and Research Data Alliance, if you will. And so one of the things that we realized not very long ago was we were basically attacking all the same problems in different organizations, or as I like to call it, doing the same work but keep changing badges. Changes badge in an organization, but the problem remained the same. And the issue with that is that you sort of this movable feast of people where you just sort of jack up the logo, move the people in, and then you continue to work on the same thing. And it makes sense to kind of formalize that. So this is the diagram, the working diagram that we've been using. And it shows just 3 organizations. There's probably more. You could add Force 11 in here and maybe a couple of others. But there, at least within Earth Science, there has always been this persistent interest in rescuing old data. And I think Ruth got to that earlier, talking about, for those of us who know what EPSIDIC is, how many bits is EPSIDIC? For those in the room, come on. 5 or 6. Thank you. All right. Or non-parity ASCII, or just going back in time, Harris with his 48-bit floating point word. And no, I mean, these were things that we used to deal with all the time. And of course, when we stored those data away, we did the best thing that we could at the time. Magnetic tape at 556 BCD, 1600, 6250, exabyte, whatever format it was, or paper tape in some cases. These things need to be brought up to date. Now, our experience has been federal agencies don't really have an appetite to do that. Choose your federal funding agency, but most of the appetite has been for new research and old data, which is so critical for figuring out how the Earth works. Filling in those gaps has not been something that people want to throw any significant part of their budget. So that's been relegated to ESIP and CODATA and RDA to take up the slack there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Research Data Alliance. Has been going through a reboot of late, so not called DataRescue anymore, and a little bit of rebranding to bring the name up and to, sorry? Yes, and so that means I have the wrong name in my presentation, but that's okay. Data conservation, but in Philadelphia last April, there was a really good session that Denise chaired that reviewed exactly what we wanted to do with the group that used to be DataRescue, that started out as pulling things out of a box, photographic plates, and digitizing them, things that weren't born digital and bringing up to the digital age. And of course, one of the things that we've seen is that data that are created today may be in peril already just due to bad curatorial practices. And so data may need to be rescued as soon as they're created, or prevent the rescue anyway. And so it's data. Now, if I could type, I would just put in data conservation. And that is the name of the new group going forward. And we hope, we have high hopes there will be really good engagement going forward at Plenary 15 in Melbourne, Australia, coming up in March. So a couple of years ago, well, it's getting long on the tooth. Sorry? 18 months, but it's 2020. I'm going to call it 2 years. We rebooted another group, which used to be called DataAtRisk Task Group. Now, you could think of the task groups under CoData similar to the clusters within ESIP or the interest groups in RDA. Same sort of thing, where people who, birds of a feather will flock together and start to tackle the same problem. CoData works a little bit differently. It's older. It has a lot more member states. There's a lot more developing worlds. So you see that there's a little different focus in terms of what people consider data that need rescuing. And in Southern Asia, in Africa, in South America, the type of data that needs to be rescued is a little bit different than what we see as a researcher retires and they bring you a box of tapes or a box of printouts. It really is more data archaeology. So that's the perspective that we're coming from with this new group called Improving Data Access and Reusability, which is really what it is. And we've been pretty active this year. We had an invited talk in Montreal for IUGG, one of the older geophysical union groups, as well as what Ruth mentioned earlier with Science Gateways. We presented that very poster over there in San Diego. And then we had a really, really good session at AGU just last month, a lightning session that had people's perspectives. And what we found there was it was a rich source of recipes for exactly how to do data rescue. It wasn't like baking a cake. So a couple of the things there, you can see this roadmap. Whoops, can't do that. But if I were to zoom in on it, you can see there's sort of a step-by-step roadmap that this particular researcher went through to resuscitate data. Included getting funding, finding hardware, identifying what the format of the data were, and assessing the actual value to see if there was a good return on investment for even going through and doing data rescue. And those are just, I think we had more. No, maybe that's everybody. Yeah, maybe 2 more. I think we had 10 total lightning talks. If you haven't done a lightning talk at AGU, I do believe it's kind of the wave of the future. It's a good compromise between a poster session and a talk, and it is never boring because people are on the clock. It's like you're trying to win a game show with your talk/poster. But it's a great chance to engage electronically after that in a forum where you can just kind of go back like speed dating and go back between the talks and talk to people who are all speaking on the same thing. Looking forward to this year, as I already mentioned, we will have representation and a session at the Research Data Alliance 15th plenary. We're already up to 15th that do per year. And we are hopeful to have a session or at least representation at EGU, which is a little late this year. It's a month late in May in Vienna. And then coming up, we will have to atone for our activities at the CoData plenary session, which has not had a set date or location yet. So those are our activities, and this is sort of the glue that holds it all together, that transcends just one organization. So any questions? No? Clear. So we said how many people were here for the first time? I'm sorry?
Did you mention that those e-lightnings are available online?
I did not, but those e-lightnings are available online, as Denise just said.
And so you can go in and
You can actually go in, and play around with them, and they're very interactive. We will be pulling these together, all the talks from the lightning session together, as part of our little treasure trove of resources. And I think the overall objective is to take this and build a rubric for where do you start when you want to do a data rescue operation? Because there's probably somebody who's done it already and they considered it a one-off. They struggled to get funding. They struggled to assess the value of the data that they were doing. It's probably aligned with their own science work or research. And then some were successful and some were not. And so I think the original premise of all of this was to pull these things together so that we would know what other people are doing, which goes to the larger theme of ESIP. So thanks. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Data rescue sounds like it's rescuing old data, right? So you're not including in that, the long tail stuff that's maybe new, right?
Is that you're asking if that's true?
Yeah, well, what is it limited to old data?
No,
Okay.
it is not. So with both the improving data access and reusability, it is not limited to old data. It's all data. So as Steve mentioned, there's challenges sometimes with brand new data that all of a sudden is not accessible. Either somebody doesn't have the right repository or they don't know how to do it, or they create their own metadata format, all of those things. So data rescue overall, I think, is what people mean by it might be undergoing a transformation, but it's also one of the reasons why the RDA group used to be called DataRescue, and it started out with a focus on kind of what we think of as traditional data rescue, kind of baking the seismic tapes so you can actually read them, and digitizing paper records and all of that. But the group itself was evolving to look at some of the long tail issues, keeping digital data in appropriately or able to be read formats, all of that. And that's one of the reasons why, we actually had a long discussion at RDA P13 about what this should be called, because you don't just look at it as an end product. You don't look at the data rescue after the data has already been collected. And so it's one of the reasons why we kind of centered on that term of data conservation, because conservation is an ongoing process. It is not a one and done sort of process. And it takes place throughout, from the initial data and prior to when the data is created past. And so that's one of the things that, so I think the term data rescue may be undergoing an evolution of what we think of it, and maybe sometimes we need to call it something different. But what Steve was talking about kind of at the end there was actually a really good transition, I think, to one of the things that we want to spend, this idea of sharing our stories around this whole process. What works, what doesn't. Essentially, our session title, which Steve never said, but I actually really love it, was called Dirty Stories of Data Rescue. We actually had a not safe for work title originally, working title. Sharing what's worked and what hasn't worked, and maybe why it didn't work. And so a lot of what we're doing is we're trying to capture these stories and develop these user scenarios so we can figure out how best to implement this matching service for.
Which I know the big reason why we changed it is at risk data commons. At risk is any kind of data that is at risk. So it could be new, it could be old, it could be, all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we also have a e-learning session at AGU.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the citation and also metrics. And one of the talk, actually, I got wide open because, my ignorance. They also start to do the DOI for the physical object.
Mm-hmm.
The sample they collect from oceans, whatever. So I think that our doing here is not only on the digital data, right?
No,
Right,
no,
okay,
we
so-
are not limiting to digital,
Sure, okay,
to
great.
digital data. We're talking about
Even like,
the entire scope of things. And in fact, the user scenario that we're going to eventually get to is a little bit of a combination of looking at physical objects and
physical
digital.
objects. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
very, very important. Even probably
Right,
those,
yeah.
those probably even more at risk.
Yes and no.
course.
It depends on the, and physical objects are very near and dear to me. That's how I got involved in all of this because of I work at the Geological Survey of Alabama, and we have a very large core repository that was terribly documented, except for in some guy's head. And so, who then had a stroke and passed away. And so then,
You
but-
do have some use case which are physical objects, right?
yes,
Right.
yes. One of the reasons we're calling them more user scenarios rather than use cases is because they're getting into a little bit of that nitty gritty. Oh, hey, this is the issue that we actually had when we tried to do this. So it's a little bit broader than what use cases are generally considered. And so that's one of the reasons why we've kind of shifted it to user scenarios or user stories rather than use case. Unless Ruth wants to totally correct me on how I stated that.
I actually have a question about your user scenario. So I get the sense that I most often see these sorts of data rescue stories in data papers. But is there a best practice for how to report your use case, how to find other use cases, or what needs to be reported when you report your user scenarios or use cases?
Oh, that's a great question, and I would love to have an answer for that. But one of the things, and I think Chris might have a little bit of an answer too. One of the things is when something doesn't work, we tend to be reluctant to share, and really we need to be comfortable sharing what doesn't work as well as what does, so we don't make the same mistakes again and again. So.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I've been in this space for about 25 years. Like Denise cores were always a big challenge. And really one of the key things that we found, we had a large project at AGI with DOE for about 10 years. And the case study successes are actually when they stop being a DataAtRisk. So things like the the marine geophysical data set system at USGS, for instance, that was actually a product of a DataRescue we facilitated. So I think it's things like this atriskdata.org kind of approach that ending up having that catalog will be very good. But I think the real success is when it either gets a new life or is a link into a community as a persistent resource. And that was how we've seen it propagate forward. And now after a couple decades of successes without a lot of fanfare, it's now sort of becoming more of a standard operating procedure rather than something sort of esoteric.
Right. Well, and so one of the motivations, kind of getting back to your question, Alexis, for the sessions that I have been running at AGU and GSA for the past several years is to try and help normalize sharing some of the different pathways and those stories of how people have successfully or maybe not as successfully gone about this. And you said sometimes you find the pathways in data papers, but often it's the very cleaned up. And it's a cultural challenge to share when we screw up. And when I say screw up, I don't necessarily mean that it was a bad thing that I did, that I made a mistake. It's just whatever I did didn't work. So I wanted to be clear. When I say I screw up, it's not necessarily a negative thing because I learned something.
So Denise,
Mhm.
when we are going from the data rescue to say data conservation,
Mhm.
are we saying that under data rescue it was more urgent, and then under data conservation we're widening our scope a bit, so those that aren't as urgent would be included?
No, data conservation, I think, includes the urgency. Because if you just think about conservation in general, there can be there's one duckbill platypus left kind of oh my gosh, we've got to do something. Or it can be, hey, we're seeing long-term effects of, so conservation kind of encompasses that immediate, wow, we've got to do something this very minute, versus the longer term. So it kind of addresses that whole spectrum, thank you, as well as there can be considered, if you say, oh, we've got to look at DataRescue for all data sets, that can cause some people to have an immediate, no, my data's fine. Don't tell me I'm doing something wrong. But if you talk about conservation, people tend to be a little bit more open to learning about it. So, yeah. The great quotation that Bruce Karen did, it's like most of it, we have a lot of the technical challenges solved. It's the social problems that are causing our data problems or something to that effect, that most of the problems are around, cultural change and how people think about things rather than a lot of the tech
So that's
itself.
a reaction to the reaction.
Kind of, yeah. And so and so one of the points of the IDAR CoData group is to help people hopefully help make that decision about how urgent something is. And Matt, actually, if he's still online, has recently been doing something about risk assessment of data sets. I think that paper came out, right? It's been submitted. Okay, all right. Yeah, it's one of those where I'm like, I was involved at one point and then I had too many things to do. So yeah.
Yeah, so wow, that's loud. Is that a better volume? This is very hard to assess. So hi, I'm Kelsey, and I just joined ESIP in the last half year, I guess. And one of the first thing that I've gotten to work on is this data risk assessment paper, which Matt just shepherded through submission. Right now, it's been submitted to a preprint and also to the Data Science Journal, but it hasn't been published yet.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, I wanted to bring it up, Denise, because I really liked what you were talking about in terms specifically of publishing things that aren't successful. I think becomes a lot simpler when you have a tool like a risk assessment matrix. You can then say, not, I did this thing and it didn't really work. Instead, you can say, hey, I tried this thing and the results are codifiable in this matrix, which I can now publish for the greater good of all.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I wanted to make sure that everybody in this room was aware that this tool exists and it's pretty good. And like within EDGI, our background is in at-risk data, and like it has gone well sometimes and poorly other times, and we haven't really written about it. But I think that this is a tool, like I tested it as a use case and I was able to like identify some of our past stuff, whether it was good enough.
Right.
And that's I think the first time that we've been able to do that in a systematic way.
And I think that is a huge step forward because I have a couple things that I like to repeat. One, I don't want to make the same mistakes as somebody else. I want to make new and exciting mistakes. Another big thing, particularly from working with my core collection, and I think Chris will probably agree with us, something is better than nothing. Even if that something is not right, something's better than nothing. And I recently heard a phrase that I have really, really taken to heart. Anything worth doing well is worth doing poorly. Let me explain that. It gets back to that something is better than nothing. And it also gets you over that hurdle of perfection. The barrier to getting things done is perfection, is the idea that it needs to be perfect. But sometimes incremental change is the way you need to go. So Chris and then Steve.
So Denise, I'm curious what this community's thought process is right now when you look at NSF's data management plan requirements, which are just largely garbage. Because every time I'm reviewing proposals, it's pretty much, yeah, we're managing it, and then the project ends and institutional repository, throw it over the transom.
Mm-hmm.
What is the thought process in the folks that are, in the conversations that you're with as far as planning for that transition post activity, particularly when they're not associated with large instrument systems, that you have institutional supports like NOAA or NASA or something, but it's sitting at some university and the guy's data collection sits in a in a shoebox.
I'm going to let other people answer this as well. I can speak from personal experience working with people that, most of my funding, we were talking about this a little earlier today, most of my funding comes from DOE, from the Office of Fossil Energy. And they have data requirements and data management plans, and they're not great on the proposals. And some of the repositories that are used are really kind of terrible. There is a growing awareness, and you get pushback from some domain scientists that it's an additional burden and they don't have time for it. And then they complain that they can't find anybody else's data and can't use it. So yeah. So it's a struggle, I think, that there is a growing awareness that it needs to be done, but people are not necessarily sure how best to do it while still maintaining everything else that they need to do, when sometimes if they shift just a little bit of their efforts, all of a sudden a lot of their other stuff is going to get a lot easier. But I'll let, I know Ruth has opinions on this too.
Wrong.
You have opinions on this. You may not want to share them, but I know you do.
Yes, okay. So one of the reasons why this at-risk data commons got started was the recognition that some agencies who shall not be named don't understand that it's their responsibility to take care of their data forever. There are some agencies who do get that, and some of them are in the room. But that doesn't mean that they have the money to do that. In fact, usually it means they don't have the money to do that, but they're trying really hard anyway. So this is a way of sort of trying to crowdsource solutions. And it came out of, the election in 2016. In Boulder and the Denver area in particular, there are a zillion retired NOAA, NASA, USGS, et cetera type people, and other really smart programmers, because we're a Google site and Apple site, and we have more startups. Well, except for San Francisco, we have more startups than most places. And these guys, they have time and energy and are willing to put it into rescuing data. And, it may be, it's a form of volunteer work, I agree. But that's the reason why the whole thing started, is to try and help under-resourced groups, people who don't have a clue what to do with their data, et cetera, to help find them some support in the public. And we know that the need is great. I personally have a list of 900 NASA data sets that they would like rescued. I used to do this through my class that I taught at the Graduate School of Library and Information Science. I used to assign each of my students a data set that, well, they got to pick them, but they had to go actually do what was needed to do what you said, which is get it back into the, in this case, the NSSDC data catalog, as something that's now usable. And so that's kind of the goal. We'll see if we can get there. I actually am impressed that we've made as much progress as we have, given that there's nobody really being funded to do this. We actually have a company that's developing the software called Cloudburst, and they're doing it just 'cause. They're a data company and they, basically saw the need and were upset about it. And they're basically just doing it. So I guess that's all I.
So somewhat related to that, Chris, is I think one of the reasons why we're trying to capture some of these user scenarios a little bit and not only making these potential pathways available to other people to figure out what to do, but also by sharing these and documenting them, publishing them when we can, I think it starts to highlight to program managers or other decision makers that this is a bigger problem with a lot more effort that may be needed, and maybe more resources need to be dedicated to it. So that is, I know, one of the reasons that I'm very motivated to be a part of this is to help start influencing some of the policy decisions that get made about how funding gets distributed. Now, we all want the new shiny research, but the new shiny research is better if we have access to all the data that has already been collected. And it's, if you want to be good stewards of finances, if you want to really get down to the nitty gritty, we've got to take that in mind. So yeah, it is a challenge. And the challenge comes from multiple directions, but sometimes we just need to keep being that voice screaming into the void.
So I have a Texasism, and that's where my family is from. And my grandmother used to say that done is better than good. Because in a lot of instances, getting things done is the hardest part. But you can talk about how good it's going to be, in a theoretical sense, if you could just get it together. And in many cases, everything that matters is done. I have to take exception with Ruth's statement about Cloudburst just doing it. Actually, Ruth was the primary motivator. We were at a meeting at Johns Hopkins University, and we thought, wouldn't it be a good idea if we got something done? And I believe Joan was at that meeting, and she's the owner of Cloudburst. And the Earth Science mob, me, Ruth, and Sophie, managed to convince her that it was a good thing to do. And so that's sort of that in-kind resources. That's how things get done. But I'm trying to crack this nut at an institutional level, and I find it very hard. There's the same sort of head in the sand attitude that we point fingers at people when they talk about climate change. In other words, it doesn't affect me today, so I'm just going to get done what I need to do to get to tomorrow. And while we're good at pointing that finger about these larger global issues, it's very interesting to see how the same research community can turn around and be guilty of exactly the same thing. I think one of the ways that we solve that problem is by calling it by its name and what it is. It's not a misalignment of priorities. It's just stupid. Because the data that are created today will be the data at risk for sure tomorrow if there's not a change, and not just a change in the way data are collected and curated now, but the way that it just goes all the way back. And so that goes to institutional priorities at the federal funding level, because the program managers are self-optimizing for how they can get brownie points, and it's never to go back and resuscitate old data because nobody cares. We talk about it in terms of the tenure incentives in academic institution. Everybody says, yeah, we need to make it so the data collectors get tenure based on how much data they collect, and then the needle never moves. And so I think the real challenge to us is how do we get to that in a real and substantive way so that it actually changes? Who do we need to talk to say, I would like to see you in an open forum say that old data don't matter, it's only new data. And then have the correct conversation about priorities instead of sweeping that under the rug all the time, because we keep coming back to the same conversation. And like I say, I'm doing it at an institutional level, and I look people right in the eye and say, are you going to do your data right or not? And if they say, no, I'm oversubscribed, I'm going to go with short-term thinking, then we can have a different conversation. But as long as we're saying that people have the right priorities, we're just sort of misaligned, and we'll keep missing it, and the problem will persist.
Yeah, and that also does get a little bit back to your, perfect is the enemy of done kind of thing. You're saying that we're not making these big changes, but I actually do see some of those smaller incremental changes slowly starting to happen, but it's not happening nearly fast enough. But so again, it's coming down to culture. We need more social scientists here. Do we have any more comments kind of generally before we start looking, like kind of walking through a little bit of this user scenario? Okay.
Since we also mentioned this is not only for the old data, right? Even some data, if someone try to find a host or whatever, would that be included? Because we data center do start to collect more community data sets, which they are not funded by the NASA or regular whatever.
Yeah.
So because some they do have a value, okay, to be, but they don't have funding to find a host. So would that be also qualified for this data conservation here? Or, see?
Yes, yeah, I think that is actually a really good lead-in. And I know that there has been some work on, repository finder tool sort of thing that I know is not in the best of shape, but the idea is there to start trying to help people identify places to host their data. But, even the best of us have had issues with this. I mean,
I lost a data set.
yes, I was going to say Ruth has one of the data conservation fail because of timing and funding and just the inability to find another place to put it within a very limited amount of time. And, she did not have the funding to support continuing where it was.
We do have a case of what we call this catch-22, because nowadays some journal, when you publish the papers, they will say, well, does your data, has already find a host?
Yeah.
So that's pretty requisitive question. But for data center, they will say, well, have you ever published your algorithm in your paper? Then before that, we are going to take care of that. So it's kind of just a little bit.
So, yeah. And I know that's a conversation that is definitely happening with publishers and editors and funding agencies about how to kind of manage that aspect of things. And that is obviously part of this. But one of the things is most data is not associated with a publication. That's something a lot of people don't like to admit, but it is very true. Most data is not in a peer-reviewed published journal or associated with a peer-reviewed article. Almost none of the data I do goes into a peer-reviewed article, but it goes into reports that decision makers use. And so that data does still need to be accessible. So there are multiple ways that we're going to need to look at, and as well as providing the support for those data centers, repositories, and what have you for long-term maintenance, because the current funding model does not necessarily provide for long-term maintenance of data. So that is an additional policy challenge that I think we're going to need to face. Unfortunately, we can't solve it all today. We'd love to, but we can't. And I keep coming back to this user scenario because I really want other input. Ruth and I and a couple other people have spent some time. One of the motivations for us to start to do this was to figure out how to make the kind of this matching work, and how the workflow would actually look, and how things get assigned, and how you make decisions and all of that. And so we started working on this user scenario that was sort of made up, but has roots in reality, as I'm sure everybody in this room is actually going to recognize. And so what we started with this is we acted like that this was an actual submission. This was a test submission put together by Joan, kind of very similar to some things that she did through DataRescue Boulder. And someone, Mrs. Data Meisterina, a data submitter submitted this is the information she submitted, is about, data consists of images that were taken in the 30s of streams and waterways. she thinks that they need to be digitized plus an addition of metadata. The reason that it is at risk is because the original images are housed in Atlanta at NOAA Old Crap Library, because we had to make up a name, and that facility is being shut down. And so what we started to do is, who is the primary actor? The person who submitted the data. Supporting actors are, the data heroes or data advocates, other stakeholders who might be interested in this data. This is a way for us to help assess, is it worth it? This is not everybody necessarily. The preconditions, what are the existing conditions? And what does a successful outcome look like? What does a failure outcome look like? A successful outcome, imagery is, this is like the perfect scenario, right? Imagery is digitized, modern metadata created or documented. Both are now housed in a repository with aspirations for long-term maintenance and access. In addition, a home for the physical images has been identified and has appropriate climatic conditions, et cetera, to preserve these long-term. The failure is that the images are lost with nothing. And then we have a couple ideas of what a minimal acceptable outcome, like a temporary home or, some scanning, some minimal metadata. As well as a detailed documentation of what was actually done. So building in that provenance of the data. And so, is this where we really want to start getting feedback and all of that? The main success scenario, like what is the pathway to get there from here? The link, by the way, if you have Wi-Fi, the link is from the session description. So it may be easier because essentially, as Ruth put up her diagram, there are places where tasks get assigned or there are essentially subroutines. And so this is kind of the main pathway, and then there are the extensions that we developed. Ruth, please give feedback on how I'm doing this and what you actually want me to do. So she can.
I actually think you ought to read through this so people can think about it.
Okay. So start at the top and read through all of it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Really,
Someone submitted this. This data consists of images that were taken in the 1930s of streams and waterways. Needs digitized plus add metadata. This is what the submitting person has put in. The results will need a new home that go to that supports whatever technology is used to digitize these images. The original images are housed in a building in Atlanta, so travel there or locals need to be able to access them. Probably need to bring equipment to digitize as well. Images are in the NOAA Old Crap Library located on the 3rd floor, open to the public, closed on Sundays. So that is the information that is a typical sort of information that somebody might submit saying, hey, I think that this data needs help. And
he left the room, but I apologize to Dawn that we used the NOAA Old Crap Library.
That was not our choice. We should probably change that to Federal Old Crap Library or unknown old. We do abbreviate it later, so it doesn't. It's not quite as. But hey, I could say that it's the Survey Old Crap Library. How about that? So I came up with various stakeholders and interests. Ruth and I were kind of coming back and forth. Who might be interested in this information? Obviously, historians are top one. Hydrologists looking at the change, geomorphological changes, ecologists, climate change people, environmentalists, geographers, land use change people, water quality people, hunters and fishers might be very interested in this sort of information. So you can see that there could be a very broad cross-section of people who might have interest in this. And we stopped at that point, but there's probably a lot more. So the current condition, like the preconditions, yeah.
I'm just wondering, so you're going to continue, but like when people submit the data, what does it suggest in terms of fields? Like, does it ask for, this sounds like a really quality submission. where it tells you the access constraints, the location, the timeline, and all this sort of stuff. Is that already embedded in a form?
Yes and no. We're working on figuring out exactly what all needs to be embedded in that form and to what level. I think we decided to, one of the reasons we decided to start with this user scenario as one of the first ones is, first off, it is something that both Ruth and I have experience with, sort of related things. And it's not like the perfect submission, but it is a fairly robust submission. So, kind of going for some of the low-hanging fruit to figure out exactly what you would need. And then we can go back to some of the, where people are like, I know of this data set in somebody's basement, and that's all I know. That one's gonna be a lot more challenging to figure out. But built into this process is also kind of a little bit of a back and forth with whoever is the submitter plus other players that might be involved. So the preconditions that we know of, there are 2 years to save these images before the building they are in is destroyed, and there are no current plans to rescue this stuff. This is coming from the submitter, by the way. Also, the submitter is unaware of any digital copies anywhere. Also, there isn't any formal metadata, just notes on the imagery. This is coming from the data, from the person who's submitting the request. So, we have to start by taking that at face value. And I kind of mentioned what those post conditions, what a success end condition would look like. Imagery is digitized with modern metadata, et cetera. Failure, images are lost without any sort of preservation, and the minimal acceptable outcome would be kind of an intermediary sort of thing. So when we start, this submission comes in, it gets, we get those involved get a notification that there is a submission. A data advocate or advocates review this new submission and select this one for assessment. So we're looking at this as kind of a ticketing sort of system. A data advocate assesses the current plans, if any, for the submission. So let's go to that extension, if it lets me jump down there. As a part of the initial assessment, what we would do is that the data advocate contacts NOAA Old Crap Library. We do apologize that we use the term NOAA. This was how it was submitted to us as a test case, okay? You were out of the room when we apologized for that. We abbreviated it as NOCL to make it easier for the remainder of this. So that was the first step, is to contact. And so then we start getting into these yes, no, if then sort of things where, hey, a data advocate selects that task, says, hey, I'm going to contact them and make sure that that is actually the case, that there are no current plans. If yes, determine the scope of the plan. If the scope is at least the minimal acceptable outcome, then discuss maybe with NOCL whether or not more work would be supported or desired. If no, change the status to complete. We're done. It meets the minimal acceptable outcome. Okay. If yes, proceed with the further steps as outlined below. If scope does not meet minimal acceptable outcome, proceed as if there is no plan, or proceed. Data advocate contacts NOCL or contacts NOAA or the larger body, if there is a larger body, about plans for storage of physical products as well as any digital products. And then again, kind of a yes, no sort of thing. Does NOAA have plans for storage or archival of the physical products? And again, if it meets minimal acceptable, et cetera. Does NOAA have plans for storage archival of the digital projects? So we actually split this into the difference between, do they have a plan for the physical stuff? Do they have a plan for the digital stuff? Because there's different requirements for that. And it's not always, you don't necessarily want to get rid of the physical stuff just because you digitize it, because there can be a lot of value in the original physical objects. You may never be able to recollect them. Technology may change and you may get different information by redigitization at a later date, all of that. So that's where we're getting back to the thinking about both physical and digital data products. And so If yes, determine the timeline and parameters of the deposition of those products. If no, the data advocate would create a task to help we kind of subclassified our heroes as different types of heroes because everybody has different skill sets for an investigation repository finder heroes, because there's some people that are very good at finding repositories and there are people like me who are not necessarily as familiar with it. So one of the parts of this matchmaking service would be kind of that repository finder. And it's a similar thing going through for the physical objects. And then after you go through that part, then the data advocate determines some other necessary steps. The data advocate contacts NOCL to determine access to the images. And related to that, you get to, would they be willing to ship those images somewhere else for people to kind of be distributed and digitizing them? Or do you have to come there? What are access constraints? Do you have to have a certain level of clearance? Do you have to have a certain skill set? Do you have to have, the white gloves, whatever. So it also helps determine what kind of people can be involved in the rescue. If they're not willing to ship the images somewhere else, or they are unable to, then you either need to have people who are local to get the physical access or be willing to travel. And remember, at this point, it is a primarily volunteer sort of thing, so it would have to be kind of a self-funded sort of thing. So again, it limits access. If access to digitize the images is unattainable, because maybe for whatever reason we can't get it, then this project gets flagged. And you have to then we go back to the original submitter or the original person involved with to determine what, if any, are the next steps. So again, this could be a failure point or an end of the process. If someone has a better term than failure point, I would love it, because so much negative connotation. I mean, we tried, it was not an acceptable outcome, Anyway, because another aspect of that is, even if you can't digitize the physical images, is there still value in obtaining, creating a digitization of associated metadata? Because again, getting back to the whole something's better than nothing, that the metadata associated with those images may have value on its own as data itself. You can tell that Ruth and I really had a whole lot of fun with this. Yeah, we started using a template for this, and the template was like, oh, this should be about 2 pages. And then when we got to about page 14, we realized that we were doing something different. Yes, Bob.
So it seems to me that there are potentially lots of, if you will, failure points here.
Uh-huh.
And if you kind of look at all of them and you think, well, gee, we've got to digitize, and we may have to, have just a whole separate metadata effort. And then we might also need to put it temporarily somewhere until we can find a permanent place to store it. But looking at all of these failure points, if you will, we kind of have to say, well, if we're not going to find a temporary place to store it, is it even worth the effort of, taking a triage approach of digitizing and doing the metadata, because perhaps there's a smaller data set that we could temporarily store and save in the meantime. And I guess at the same time, you're weighing this off against the time line that you have here.
Well, and some of this, it's like I fully expect that some of these things will reach an end state of not done because we don't have somebody who can do it, as well as starting to build in some of the risk assessment, and that risk matrix, because that the risk assessment builds in not only the time sort of thing, like, oh my gosh, this is happening tomorrow, we need to do something. But a little bit into, okay, is this data set recreatable? You know, can we regenerate it? Is there another copy of it somewhere? You know, so some of that probably still needs to be built into this user scenario. But you know, as I said, you know, as we started going down the rabbit holes of things that, you know, Ruth and I in particular had directly dealt with some of these very specific issues. That's one of the reasons why we wanted to kind of share this, because we don't have you know, we don't have a point in here. Are there other copies of these images that are already digitized? No, we actually don't. So that's one of the reasons why we wanted to, that was actually a really good point. Or maybe there are sub collections within this that we might, you know, target sub collections or something like that rather than the entirety. Yeah.
If I can roll this back up a little bit to
Yeah.
the top level. So are you envisioning target repositories in essence sort of being pre-registered? Having done actually a transfer like this, and the nightmare, the key component is that nothing ever moves unless there was someone really actually looking to build into their collection. And they're generally those repositories, because you need to have basically the accession standards preset versus always sort of being I'm chucking my data and it's got a time limit on it. Is that part of the envisionment that you know, that the destinations would be out there proactively sort of registering, saying we're accepting stuff or looking for it?
I'll let Ruth answer that, but.
So, so the whole reason why there's a quote data advocate in the loop, who's somebody who really knows data, is because there does have to be a triage step, you know, of, I'm sorry, this is just not going to be possible.
Yeah.
And in many cases, for example, in this kind of a scenario, you're absolutely right. For example, the several hundred data sets from NASA, they want them back. We know the name of the people. We can talk to them and say, is this good enough now? We did what you asked. But if it's a case where it's like a long tail investigator and he's, you know, dropping the box off at your door kind of thing, you know, you might have to do a fair amount of work to get to the point where you basically just say, I'm sorry. Yeah, you know, this technology is probably good for 3 years, but there isn't a repository anywhere that we know of that will take it, which is, by the way, how I lost my data set. Because it was on Amazon and they started charging, so people started using it at $40 an hour. And I couldn't afford that.
Yeah.
So I lost it.
So I think I think kind of to get to your point, Chris, there will probably be multiple points within this process where you're going to have to do that triage about, okay, you know, because at this point we're not even sure what's there and whether or not we can have enough information to put it into a repository. We hope that with things like the repository finder tool and some of the stuff that similar to that, the people working as data advocates are going to have an awareness of places that would be willing and able to accept and what levels of quality they are willing and able to accept. But yeah, it's definitely going to have to be, there's going to be multiple triage steps along the way. You know, it probably needs, it might need to be a little bit more explicit in our scenario. Yeah. Maybe not in this one because, but you know, just in general, we might need to be a little bit more explicit about when you make that determination, if there is a place to put this, at least temporarily, because one of the things we know we will be asked is whether or not we're going to be a data orphanage, essentially. And at this point, we do not envision the DataAtRisk.org setup to be a data orphanage. It might hold temporary data, but it is not meant to be an actual repository sort of thing. You know, it may like transfer through us. Yeah, a data shelter. Yeah, it's a shelter rather than an actual orphanage. Well, see, then that gets a little bit more to yeah. Anyway.
Shelters end up inadvertently either losing the data or not being responsible about it, and in effect they become a shelter that sort of euthanizes these data sets.
Well, I think we would have to be clear about whether or not, if we were to have to euthanize a data set, that we, we're very obvious about what we were doing.
As a last refuge, I mean,
Yeah.
it ends up that is your role. It's kind of binary.
The challenge right now is we don't have storage. It's like, let's be blunt, we don't have storage. We have a website right now. We don't have storage. We can't accept, but we're getting there, right?
So as I mentioned, we do have this company called
Yes.
Cloudburst.
Yes.
And they do have servers and they do have some storage. And actually they have a fair amount of storage. But
they're a company.
But they're a company.
They have been incredibly generous, and Joan is amazing, and she's incredibly passionate. And I know that she would want to be that no-kill shelter. I'm trying to be protective of her and her company as well. So.
Right, which needs to happen. Because, obviously if they go under or something stupid like that, all of this is for naught.
Yeah, we have no paddle anymore.
Right. So I would echo everything that Denise was saying, except that we do have a little bit of storage, but not huge.
Yes.
Put it this way, we cannot be a no-kill shelter, put it that way.
But
Because-
hopefully we can be a refuge.
Right.
Yeah. Where were we? Okay.
But we do have.
That's okay.
In the process, I guess, for the data advocate, expectation this person is independent of the two parties, the destination and the source?
Not necessarily, because these are all volunteers. These are all, at this point, these are all going to be volunteers, and they're going to be self-selected volunteers. So they may have a connection or whether it's professional or personal or what have you, to some of these places.
I'm just sort of, it's sort of the premise that not all data is actually good.
Yes.
And so I'm just wondering what the thought process is on addressing that issue.
That not all data are equally worthy.
Well, that goes back to the at-risk matrix.
Yeah.
And that level of triage.
Mhm.
Obviously, a small data set that is very important would get higher priority than a
Mhm.
big data set that may be important, but nobody knows about.
Right. And we were also very conscious as we were working through this that, at this point, this is, these are self-selected volunteers. There may be time where there is an incredibly important data set that we just don't have anybody available to do anything with. And so that is just something we also need to be aware of as we go through this.
Right. And the other thing I wanted to note is that there are some, repositories of last resort, I guess you could call them. The fig shares of the universe, and actually even the Internet Archive now can do some of that. But it's kind of like putting things in an institutional repository. Maybe someday you'll find them. Someday, maybe. Not likely.
So I believe so far you should have a list of your data heroes or the volunteers, right? A group of them, or how do?
Would you
give us
like to
some-
sign up?
Pardon?
You can sign up.
Sure.
Please
So,
sign up. Go to the DataAtRisk.org and register yourself, please.
sure. Yes. Right. And so usually, how do you find them? And is any outreach or through, for instance, like through AGU presentations or conferences? So, because I remember last time I compared this like you guys look at doing a matchmaking, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, we do a meeting, right? So then we find one who can help.
Mhm.
So
There are several groups kind of working in that space on, for example, EDGI.
Mhm.
But like DataRescue Boulder, it's got several hundred people.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's
So I think the data advocates are harder to find than the data heroes.
yeah, but because there should be a paper coming out fairly soon on a citizen science data rescue project out of Australia, if it's not already out. I need to talk with Leslie about when that's coming out.
There's a preprint.
Hmm?
There's at least a preprint.
Yeah. That essentially they were able to find the heroes just, through citizen science sorts of efforts, the people who are doing some of the data rescue. So as Ruth said, we don't currently have PR plans or recruitment plans because we need to have something for them to come to first. It is on the horizon, definitely, but it is, it's an important step, obviously, but we're trying to get a little bit more of the structure in place before we do a big push, because we know some of the people who are going to be involved with this already. So is that a good way to kind of answer that, Ruth?
Recently, I just did because I'm a Maryland State faculty employee. So every year I did a charity campaign, right? So they put a list there who need help. And we can say we want to donate to this one, that one. So I'm not sure if this could be an idea. Since you say you will have a group of those heroes. Yeah, I'm going to join, right? So every now and then you post who need help instead of the advocate to looking for them. That also even probably the hero themselves probably even can identify which one they can help.
Right. So one of the things when you register for this, one of the visions of this is that if you go in as you're registered as a data hero, you can go in and look at what tasks are available. Right. That's part of the vision. So, and there's probably going to be a little bit, sometimes the data advocate is going to, oh, I know the perfect person to do this, and may reach out directly or what have you. But different people have different time availability, and it may change, or they may, say, oh yeah, for some reason I'm on bed rest for 2 months and I can't do anything but sit at my computer, and so therefore I'm going to look at all these tasks or what have you. And so people's availability are going to be different, and all of that, and so they can self-select. They'll have a way to look at the available tasks that have not been assigned. So yeah. I think that was a long way to answer that. But as you can see, as we were working through this, we realized that, we're putting a really big ask on our data advocates, which is one of the reasons why we're starting to look at developing this more as kind of a nonprofit sort of organization, so that we might be able to at least fund some of these data advocates, because we are putting a big ask on. And again, these things can be split. It does not necessarily have to be a single person doing all of these steps. It's kind of where we're at is kind of the data advocate is now identifying what skills data heroes need, because this is again kind of addressing your question a little bit, is that what we envision is that heroes can say, I have these sorts of skills. I am a programmer, or I am someone who's really great at finding repositories, or I'm really good at doing metadata archaeology, or I have a passion for scanning photos or, whatever. And so kind of classifying what sorts of heroes you might need, that's this next step, kind of identifying local versus remote, whether they need to be there or they can do something remotely, whether they have someone with metadata expertise for this type of data, actual digitization expertise, and access to the equipment if NOCL doesn't have it, security, whether or not they need security clearance, programming expertise, data detective skills, kind of that metadata archaeology that I just mentioned, and metadata archaeology skills, and other talents as needed. So again, this is a big ask on some of these data advocates, is to figure out all of these different types of skills. Now, granted, you can be a hero and actually have multiple of these skills, right? And then the data advocate would then need to split the request into particular components and associated tasks. Kind of the repository determination, both physical and digital. A big thing that we thought was important, and this gets a little bit also to assessing whether or not things can actually happen, is QC of the plan of each of the tasks. Some sort of quality control. Is this actually going to meet our minimal acceptable standards? And again, that is another potential exit point for a data rescue project. If an acceptable plan can't be developed, it's an exit point. Whether it's a final exit point or not, that might be different. So digitation, the QC of the plans, and these are not necessarily, it is not all linear. Digitization of the images, extraction of the metadata, and we came into various subsets of where that metadata might be. It might be written on the actual image, on the front of the image, on the back of the image. It might be on separate cards. It might be in a digital file, or it might be some various combination, or it may not exist at all. And so various combinations of that. QA/QC of the actual metadata and QA/QC of the actual data and digitized images. I'm trying to be conscious. We're almost done, aren't we? But what I would really love, I think this is set up that you can make comments on this document. Anyone can make a comment on the document. And there are links, there are bookmarks and links and extensions and descriptions of what each of these heroes might be doing as a task, what is involved in those tasks. I think everybody in this room has some sort of experience with some aspect of this type of user scenario. And so flagging things like, where do you identify the repository and what is acceptable to be submitted to a particular repository and how do you flag that, and all of that. I think we would appreciate your input on that. This is definitely something that is not final, but it is meant to help drive the development of all of this. Yes.
Okay, so you kind of brought it back to the point I wanted to make a few minutes ago, which was based on a comment you made a few minutes ago, Ruth, about Figshare or Internet Archive, and going back to, recognizing that, some repositories have their resource limitations, and that's a hard limitation, and there's no getting around it. They also have various review and appraisal requirements that say if it doesn't meet our scope, it doesn't meet our requirements, we can't take it.
Right.
And so those are hard decision points, and that's part of the appraisal process when things are submitted to a lot of repositories. But I want to also go back to what Steve said. Done is better than good. And so if the only place that you can put this is the Internet Archive, and it may be hard to find, it may be of limited accessibility, but at least it's somewhere. And so we need to be careful to, find the best place we can, but if we can't find any place, put it somewhere.
Yeah.
And so, so I want us to be sure we don't lose sight of that.
Right. No, and I fully agree with that. And maybe something that this project can do is start maybe keeping a record of data sets that we have touched and where they ended up. So it might be a way to find some of these a little bit better. But any final comments before we go get lunch? Yeah. We never have enough time at this session.
This is really just a heads up that assessment article that was written might be available soon for people to comment on. A preprint of it, I should say, would be available. And we're really looking for comments, any suggestions, criticism, hit us hard, but just hit us so that we can make it better.
Bob, I'm going to make a request of you or Kelsey or somebody. Please ping me when it is ready for that, because I may miss it because I have so much going on. But I have a lot that I want to look at with that because it's something I have to do every day. So,
I just wanted to make one comment about the whole publisher versus repository thing. And that is that there is a paper, Data Repository Selection Criteria That Matter.pdf, that came out of the publishers that's open for comment. It doesn't mention repositories, and it didn't actually consider repository requirements at all. So unless you would like the publishers to tell you what you're going to take, whether you want it or not, it might be well worth your time to comment heavily on that paper. And there's a link. It's in the OSF opens, and we can get you the link if you want it.
if you marked your attendance at this session, we can send you, and your email is in there, we will send you that link. We will also send you an invitation to join the at-risk data commons working group. We actually meet weekly, but you can cycle in and out as you have time. So, and we would encourage all of you to at least be aware of some of this, because the input that we've received from everybody in this room has been invaluable. So, anything else? Y'all have been awesome. I appreciate each and every one of you. Yeah. That's totally fine.
I don't know if anyone else besides me is local to the DC area, but OPM has closed all federal offices starting at 1 o'clock today. So if you live in the metro area, you might want to think about whether you want to go home now and call in to sessions here later this afternoon. If you're staying here at the hotel or somewhere nearby, stick around, it'll be great. But I have a feeling a few folks like me will find my way home.
Yes, I saw a notification pop up on Slack from Aaron saying the intention right now is to continue the meeting, but there is remote access, so please be safe, is kind of the upshot of all of that.
An email was sent to all attendees with additional information about what to do if you're heading out and how to access the live streams. And one more thing from ESIP, thank you for attending this session. There is a place on the Schedule info page where you can record your highlights and takeaways from this session if you would like to when you get a chance. That would be great if you could help us fill that out, because I know that Ruth and I might have different takeaways than the people in the room, and I think it's really important to capture both of those. So, all right, like I said, the link to this user scenario is from the SCED, so please comment. It will only make it better.